Hey guys, tonight, before you close your eyes, let's travel together not to a dream, but to a time when dreams and nightmares wore crowns. Let's go back more than 500 years, to a kingdom wrapped in fog and fire, to the court of a man they once called the Golden Prince. His name was Henry VIII, King of England, Lord of Ireland, defender of the faith, breaker of hearts, and destroyer of his own soul. History remembers him as a tyrant, but once he was just a boy who loved music, laughter, and the sound of church bells echoing over the Thames at dawn. Yet beneath that charm, beneath the velvet and gold, a storm was always waiting, and when it broke, it would change the face of England forever. Imagine this London in the early 16th century. The air carries the scent of smoke from the hearths, the murmur of traders along the river, and the hum of hope. England has survived the bloody chaos of the Wars of the Roses. The crown, for now, rests steady on the head of a new dynasty, the Tudors. The old wounds between the houses of York and Lancaster have healed, or so it seems, sealed by a single marriage, Henry VII to Elizabeth of York. From their union, a child is born under a summer sky at Greenwich Palace. On the 28th of June, 1491, they name him Henry. No one knows that this soft-skinned, bright-eyed infant will grow to wield a sword sharper than mercy itself. He grows up not as heir, but as the spare, his older brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, is meant to inherit the kingdom. Young Henry spends his childhood surrounded by tutors, scholars, and musicians. He learns Latin and Greek, the rhythm of the lute, the cadence of prayer. He is taught to write poetry, to dance, to ride with grace, and to speak with wit. His laughter fills the corridors of Eltham Palace. His mother, Elizabeth of York, adores him, teaching him the gentle art of kindness that he will one day forget. The poet John Skelton praises his brilliance. Even Erasmus and Thomas More, two of the greatest minds in Europe, speak of him as if he were a living miracle. They call him radiant, godly, a prince of promise. But promises have a way of darkening with time. When Henry is 10 years old, tragedy slips into the royal nursery. His brother Arthur, newly married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Spain's powerful monarchs, falls ill and dies. The court falls silent. Prayers echo through the chapel, and the little boy, still learning his Latin verses, suddenly finds the weight of a kingdom upon his shoulders. He becomes the heir. The golden boy who played the organ now belongs to history, and the shadow of destiny begins to stretch long across his path. His father, Henry VII, strict and calculating, molds him into something cold and disciplined. He forbids the boy from jousting, from risk, from laughter. And though the young prince obeys, deep inside him burns a hunger, a need to prove himself, to feel alive, to conquer and to command. By the time his father dies in the spring of 1509, Henry is 17. The bells of Westminster ring for the old king's death, and then, the next morning, they ring again for the new one. England awakens to celebration. The people fill the streets. The young king appears tall, golden-haired, radiant in crimson velvet and gold embroidery, and the crowd cheers as if the sun itself has descended upon them. They see youth, beauty, promise. They do not see the loneliness behind his smile, the ache of expectation. Within weeks, he marries Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, uniting England and Spain once more. She is older, wise, pious, and deeply in love with him. For a while, their marriage glows like dawn. Together, they dance, they hunt, they laugh, and England rejoices in the warmth of its young monarchs. But the fairy tale begins to fray almost immediately. Catherine conceives again and again, only to lose child after child. The first, a girl, stillborn. The second, Éasson, who lives just a few weeks before the bells toll for his tiny soul. Then another miscarriage, and another. Only one child, a girl named Mary, survives. Henry cradles her, calls her his pearl of the world. But he cannot silence the whisper that follows him everywhere. A daughter cannot secure your throne. England's peace dépend à son. An heir who can carry the Tudor name into eternity. And so, what began as love begins to cool, and a restlessness creeps into the king's heart. He finds comfort elsewhere in music, in hunting, in the eyes of other women. Yet no matter how far he rides, or how loud the trumpets sound, he cannot escape the echo of failure that haunts his nights. The man who once defended the church begins to doubt whether God himself has cursed his line. Behind his laughter, there is fear. Behind his faith, there is rage. And then, one day, she appears, a lady at court, clever and strange, newly returned from France. Her name is Anne Boleyn. Her eyes hold secrets and fire. She laughs when he expects her to kneel. She refuses to be his mistress, saying she will only belong to her husband. For Henry, that refusal is intoxicating. Desire turns to obsession, and obsession becomes destiny. He begins to imagine a new England, one freed from the chains of Rome, where no pope could deny him the right to love and to rule as he wishes. But this is only the beginning. The story that started with music and promise will soon drown in the sound of swords and screams. The young king who once charmed scholars will command executions. He will dissolve monasteries, destroy his friends, and cut down his queens. He will turn against the very church he swore to defend. And in his madness, he will believe that God himself speaks through his will. So as you close your eyes tonight, picture it, the flicker of candles in the great hall of Hampton Court, the smell of roses and blood, the glint of gold in the eyes of a man who believes he is chosen. Behind the crown lies a heart beating with fear. Behind the music, a storm waiting to break. This, dear listener, is not just the tale of a king. It is the story of a man who could not bear to lose control, even to heaven itself. And as we drift deeper into the night, we begin our journey into the reign of Henry VIII, the lover, the tyrant, the dreamer, and the destroyer, the king who tore his country apart in search of a son, and found only silence waiting for him at the end. The morning light spills softly over the River Thames. Glimmering against the gilded spires of Westminster, the young king steps onto the balcony, breathing in the scent of rain and roses. His face, still unmarked by age or guilt, reflects both confidence and something unspoken, a quiet hunger, the kind that hides behind charm. Beneath him, the courtyard hums with servants, courtiers, musicians, and guards preparing for another day in the kingdom of Henry VIII. A kingdom that, for a fleeting moment, believes itself to stand on the edge of a golden age. The air feels new. The banners of red and gold flutter high, and the people whisper that God himself has blessed England with a radiant monarch, tall and strong, fair of face, filled with laughter, and armed with both sword and song. He has inherited a treasury full of silver, a court bursting with beauty, and a nation eager to forget the long wars of the past. Everything seems possible. The young Henry spends his mornings on horseback, his afternoons composing music for the lute, and his evenings lost in dance and wine. He loves to wear jewels and armor polished to a mirror shine, loves to tilt in the lists, to test his strength before cheering crowds. His smile disarms even his enemies, his wit draws laughter from every hall. In those first years, he is not yet the tyrant. History will remember, he is radiant youth wrapped in silken sunlight. But even in the laughter, destiny has begun to stir. Catherine of Aragon, his queen, is his equal in dignity and devotion. She prays for him, counsels him, and rules beside him with grace. When he rides to war, she governs England with a steady hand. The court whispers that they are soulmates, two monarchs bound by faith and love. Yet the one thing their union cannot summon is a living son. The queen conceives and loses, conceives and mourns, her tears hidden behind the heavy curtains of the royal nursery. Still, she never complains. She holds his hand after each loss and assures him that God will grant them another chance. Henry smiles, though behind his eyes burns quiet panic. Every monarch before him who failed to secure a male heir had watched their dynasty fall into ruin. He can already hear the echo of his father's warning. A crown without a son is a crown made of glass. Years drift by like the slow movement of the tide. The court remains bright, but shadows begin to gather in its corners. Henry's restlessness grows. He is still young, still burning with the need to prove his strength to God, to his people, to himself. He throws feasts that stretch into the dawn, commands grand tournaments, and invites foreign ambassadors to marvel at his magnificence. Yet at night, when the candles fade and the palace falls quiet, he lies awake beside Catherine, staring into the dark. He dreams of sons strong, laughing boys who will bear his name, and wakes to the stillness of empty cradles. When war calls, Henry seizes it like a lover. In the summer of 1513, he sails across the Channel to France, determined to win glory as his ancestors once did. The trumpets blare, the banners snap in the wind, and the young king in shining armor rides at the head of his army, heart pounding with the thrill of conquest. He wins a battle they call the Battle of the Spurs. For the French knights fled so fast that only their spurs could be seen glinting in the dust. His triumph is sung across Europe, and for a moment, Henry feels immortal. But while he is away chasing glory, his queen faces her own war. Far to the north, Scotland invades England, hoping to strike while the king is gone. Catherine, left as regent, takes command without hesitation. She rallies the nobles, raises the banners, and rides with the troops to the northern fields. There, on a September day, English longbows darken the sky, and Scotland's King James IV falls lifeless on the field of Flodden. When the messenger rides back to London bearing news of victory, he brings with him the dead king's torn coat, a gift from Catherine to her husband. The gesture is pure steel and devotion, and Henry, upon receiving it, calls her the truest man in England. Yet even then, his triumphs cannot fill the hollow space within him, the space shaped like a sun. When at last Catherine gives birth to a daughter, Princess Mary, the bells of England ring again. Henry gazes upon her tiny face and feels genuine love. But behind that tenderness hides disappointment. No queen has ever ruled England in her own right. And though he tries to believe otherwise, the old fear returns, coiling tighter around his heart. He begins to wonder if his marriage is cursed, if God himself has turned his face away. Years later, a new presence appears at court. She is unlike the others, sharp-tongued, clever, with eyes that never bow. Her name is Anne Boleyn, and she has returned from France carrying with her the elegance and daring of another world. At first, Henry only notices her laugh, the way she turns away when he tries to charm her, the hint of defiance in her words. Then fascination becomes desire. He begins to write to her letters filled with longing, apology, and madness. "I am yours, body and soul," he tells her. And in those words, England begins to tremble. Anne is no fool. She has seen what becomes of women who surrender too easily to kings. So she refuses him. Not with anger, but with grace. "I would rather be your wife than your mistress," she says, knowing full well what that means. To make her his wife, Henry must do what no English king has dared. He must stand against the Pope. He must break the bond that ties his kingdom to the heart of Rome. And so, slowly, the man once called defender of the faith begins to question the faith itself. The years that follow are a storm of letters, arguments, and prayers that turn to threats. Henry pleads for an annulment, insisting that his marriage to Catherine was never lawful because she had been his brother's wife. The Pope hesitates, trapped between religion and politics, unable to anger Spain. Unable to defy England, Catherine refuses to yield. "I was your true wife before God," she declares, standing before judges and bishops, her voice steady as stone. The people love her for it. Henry, humiliated, seethes. The more she resists, the more his passion for Anne grows, until it becomes something darker than love, something closer to obsession. By the late 1520s, he can wait no longer. He dismisses his closest advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, when the priest fails to secure Rome's permission. He begins to see himself as chosen by God, beyond the Pope, beyond the Church. The court fractures, some whispering loyalty, others whispering fear, and then, in a moment of defiance that shakes all of Christendom, Henry declares himself supreme head of the Church of England. Bells toll across the land. Monks tremble in their cloisters. Friends who once prayed with him now pray against him. At last, in a secret ceremony in January 1533, he marries Anne Boleyn. The union is swift, despiadati, sealed in silence. Within months, Anne's belly swells, and Henry is certain the heavens will reward his courage with a son. The court waits breathless as summer turns to autumn, and on a September morning, the cries of childbirth echo through the palace. Henry's heart leaps. The midwives smile, and then the words fall like stones. A daughter. They name her Elizabeth. Henry hides his disappointment behind forced joy. But the mirror of his heart has already begun to crack. Still, for a time, the court shimmers. Anne is crowned queen, the first to be crowned alongside her husband in decades. Her coronation gown glows like molten gold. Her crown sparkles with new jewels. Yet the same people who once adored Catherine now whisper that Anne is a witch, a temptress who led the king to destroy his country. Henry pretends not to hear. Edines lavishly, builds new palaces, and tells his ministers to crush any voice that questions his supremacy. The monasteries begin to fall, ancient stones torn apart, their treasures sent to fill the royal vaults. The old faith is bleeding, and from its wounds rises a new power, the Church of England, with Henry himself as its head. But no gold can silence his growing torment. Anne bears him no sons, only miscarriages, only ghosts. She grows anxious, then bitter. Henry grows distant, then cold. The passion that once burned through the night turns to suspicion, and suspicion, in the heart of a king, becomes deadly. Courtiers trade whispers like knives. Some say Anne laughs too freely, others that she plots against the crown. Henry listens, He begins to believe. One winter evening, he looks into the fire and sees his reflection flicker, a face lined not by age but by fury. He thinks of his father's voice, of God's silence, of the empty cradles that haunt his halls. Something in him hardens. If God will not give him a son, he will take destiny by the throat himself. And so begins the unraveling. The young king who once dazzled Europe will soon become the shadow that haunts it. He will send queens to the block, dissolve the sacred and the holy, and rule with a hand that trembles between love and madness. But for now, he still smiles at court, still rides through the gardens of Hampton in the morning sun, still believes he is chosen, blessed, eternal. The courtiers bow, the trumpets sing, and the people cheer. Only the river knows the truth, carrying its slow, silent current past the palace walls, whispering the same secret again and again into the night. Nothing gold can stay. And as the torches burn low and the king's laughter echoes down the marble halls, England itself begins to dream uneasily, unaware that its golden prince is already slipping into darkness. The night after Elizabeth's birth was unusually still. Outside the palace, the rain fell softly over London, washing away the echoes of celebration, leaving only the damp scent of disappointment hanging in the corridors of Greenwich. Inside his chamber, Henry VIII sat motionless before the dying fire, his jeweled hands folded, his thoughts burning far brighter than the embers at his feet. A daughter, after everything, after the defiance of Rome, the excommunication, the broken altars and the shattered monasteries, all God had granted him was a daughter. He tried to convince himself that Elizabeth's tiny cry was still the sound of triumph, that perhaps the next child would be a son, that this was merely the beginning. Yet even as he whispered these things, a new shadow moved within him, something colder, sharper, more dangerous than despair. It was the slow birth of tyranny, the feeling that he alone could bend heaven to his will, that his word was divine law, that no one on earth or above it had the right to deny him. Anne Boleyn's laughter once filled the halls like music, but now it cut through the air like glass. The courtiers who had once admired her daring began to whisper that the Queen had lost her charm, that her sharp tongue had become venom, that her cleverness had turned to arrogance. Henry, who had once worshipped her wit, now saw only defiance. He began to speak less to her, more to his ministers, to the men who fed him half-truths and careful flattery. The same court that had knelt before Anne at her coronation now watched her falter with quiet delight. The throne is a cold place, and in the Tudor court, warmth never lasts long. As the seasons passed, Anne's beauty began to wilt beneath the weight of her husband's moods. The child she bore him, little Elizabeth, was adored for her brightness and grace. But every smile from her daughter was also a reminder of failure. Anne conceived again, and the king's eyes shone with hope. Yet the pregnancy ended in miscarriage. A second followed, then a third. Each loss carved deeper wounds into their marriage, until love was replaced by suspicion. Rumours crawled through the palace like rats. Some said Anne had bewitched the king. Others said she had been unfaithful, that her flirtations with courtiers were more than just words. Henry, desperate to escape his own disappointment, began to believe the whispers. It was easier to blame a woman than to face his own shadow. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, saw the shifting tide and steered it for his own advantage. Once loyal to Anne, he now sensed that the wind favoured change. He collected gossip, moulded it into accusations, and built a net of lies sturdy enough to trap a queen. Before long, Anne's own ladies were being questioned, her friends arrested, her brother accused of unthinkable crimes. The king did not protest, In truth, he had already left her in his heart. There was another woman now, a quiet presence in the background, pale and gentle, with kind eyes that did not challenge him. Her name was Jane Seymour, and she would soon become both comfort and curse. The spring of 1536 arrived like an omen. On the morning of May 19th, the Queen who once defied popes and kings was led through the Tower of London, dressed in grey silk, her hair hidden beneath a simple cap. The sky was clear, the air sharp. She climbed the wooden steps, with the calm of one who already knows her fate. Before kneeling, she looked toward the crowd. Thousands gathered, holding their breath. Her voice trembled only once as she spoke. "Good Christian people, I come here to die. According to law, for the king's pleasure." She asked them to pray for him. And then, without another word, she knelt. The sword flashed once in the sunlight, and the woman for whom Henry had broken an empire was gone. That night, the palace remained silent. No bells tolled for the Queen. No prayers were spoken. And yet, within 24 hours, the court was alive again, with music and celebration. Henry, dressed in white, rode out to meet Jane Seymour. To those who served him, it seemed as though the ghosts of the past had been swept away overnight, as though love could be reborn as easily as it had been buried. But something inside the king had changed forever. Once he had sought love, now he sought obedience. Jane Seymour was everything. Anne was not submissive. Soft-spoken, patient. She soothed his temper with quiet smiles, listened without argument, and obeyed without question. The court found peace in her gentleness, and Henry, weary of passion's chaos, found solace in her stillness. For the first time in years, he felt hope return. In the autumn of 1537, Jane announced her pregnancy, and the king's joy was boundless. He prayed daily, fasted, and spoke of miracles. The palace prepared for the birth of a prince. On an October morning, the prayers were answered. Jane gave birth to a healthy boy, Prince Edward, the long-awaited heir to the Tudor throne. The bells that rang that day could be heard from London to Canterbury, echoing like a promise of salvation. But every gift Henry received seemed to come with a price. 12 days after the birth, Jane fell ill with childbed fever. Her skin turned pale as linen, her breath shallow, her eyes distant. Henry sat by her bedside, begging her to live, swearing he would trade all the riches of his realm for her life. Yet, on the night of October 23rd, she slipped away, leaving him with the son he had always desired and the grief he had never expected. For once, his heart broke cleanly, and though he would marry again, none of his 6 wives would ever claim the place Jane left behind. The years that followed were heavy with silence. Henry's body began to betray him. The leg wound from his old jousting accident turned into a festering ulcer that never healed. The pain grew unbearable, the stench impossible to hide. He drank more wine, ate more meat, and grew larger, his face swelling, his once athletic frame collapsing under its own weight. The courtiers still praised him, still bowed and smiled, but behind closed doors, they spoke of the king's temper, of his outbursts, of how his laughter could turn to fury in a heartbeat. The Golden Prince of England had become its thundercloud. When the court suggested a new marriage, Henry resisted, then relented. He could not bear loneliness. Yet he no longer loved. He only sought alliance, stability, convenience. His 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, was chosen for political reasons, a match to strengthen ties with German reformers. A painter, Hans Holbein, was sent to capture her likeness. And when the portrait returned, Henry was enchanted. But when Anne arrived in person, the illusion shattered. He called her a great Flanders mare and refused to consummate the marriage. Within 6 months, it was annulled, and Anne, grateful to keep her head, withdrew quietly from court life. Cromwell, the man who had arranged the disastrous union, paid the price. Once Henry's most trusted minister, now he was accused of treason, dragged to the Tower, and executed without mercy. Power, in Henry's court, was always borrowed, never owned. On the same day Cromwell died, Henry married again, this time to Catherine Howard, a girl barely out of childhood, niece to the Duke of Norfolk, cousin to Anne Boleyn. She was young, lively, radiant, and her laughter briefly reignited the king's fading pride. He showered her with jewels, called her his rose without a thorn, and paraded her through London as proof that his youth was not entirely gone. But youth is cruel, and Catherine's heart belonged elsewhere. When news reached the king that she had been unfaithful, his rage tore through the palace like fire. She was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, the girl who had called him my lord walked to the scaffold and whispered, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." The axe fell, and Henry's heart turned to stone once more. Death left him emptier, yet more defiant. He believed himself both victim and god, a man chosen by heaven but betrayed by the weakness of others. To the world, he was still the mightiest monarch of Europe, the ruler who had defied Rome, who had built an empire of fear. But behind the throne, behind the golden mask, there was only pain, the kind that festers when remorse is buried too deep to heal. By the time he took his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, Henry was no longer the golden prince of his youth. His legs could barely carry him. His temper flared like a dying flame desperate for air. Yet Catherine, wise and calm, tended to him with patience. She read to him at night, prayed beside him, and slowly brought peace to the household. It was she who convinced him to restore his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, to the line of succession. It was she who dared to speak of forgiveness in a court built on vengeance. And though the king's rage still burned beneath the surface, some part of him began to soften, as if her voice had reached the boy he once was, the boy who loved music, laughter, and the smell of the river at dawn. But peace could not undo the years of blood. England was forever changed. The monasteries were gone. The priests scattered. The people divided. The king who had once united his realm in glory had also torn it apart in pride. His hands, once meant to bless and to build, had destroyed more than they could ever restore. And so the story of Henry VIII became more than a chronicle of kingship. It became a mirror of the human heart. For what is tyranny? If not the shadow of love gone blind, what is power? If not fear wearing a crown? As his health waned and his body decayed, Henry's spirit lingered between repentance and pride, between the man he had been and the legend he had become. Somewhere inside that fading flesh still lived the echo of the boy who played the lute, who dreamed of glory, who wanted only to be remembered. And perhaps, in those final silent hours before dawn, when even his servants dared not speak, Henry VIII did remember. Perhaps he saw the faces of the women who once loved him, the son he had longed for, the daughters who would carry his name. Perhaps he realized that every sword he raised, every law he broke, every prayer he silenced, all of it was for nothing more than a fleeting grasp at immortality. Outside, The rain fell again, soft, endless, forgiving. London slept beneath its silver veil, and the river carried its quiet song past the palace walls, whispering as it had always done. Through rain and ruin alike, nothing gold can stay. The last years of Henry VIII were a long twilight, half shadow, half flame, a slow unravelling of the body and the spirit of a man who had once believed himself to be chosen by heaven. The courtiers still addressed him as Your Majesty. But beneath the bowing and the bright ceremonies, there was a silence filled with fear. The king no longer rode at dawn. His legs, swollen and bandaged, throbbed with pain. The old wound from the joust years ago had turned against him, bleeding poison into his body, and the air around him carried the sharp, sour scent of decay. The physicians dared not speak of it. They only changed the dressings, whispered prayers, and waited for his temper to turn, for it always did. Those who served him had learned that to look too long into his face was dangerous. His moods shifted like the tide. One moment he would laugh, recalling old songs from his youth. The next he would slam his fist against the table and demand to know why God had made him suffer. The court moved as he moved slowly, cautiously, like a reflection trembling on water. The days of glory were gone, replaced by endless councils, accusations, and schemes. Ministers rose and fell like the seasons. Friends became traitors overnight. Even the light in his palaces seemed different, dimmer, softer, as if afraid to touch him. Yet there was still one voice that reached through the haze of pain and fury, the calm and gentle tone of Catherine Parr, his sixth queen, and the only one to survive him. She was not a beauty in the way his earlier wives had been, but she possessed a kind of radiance that came from stillness. Her intelligence, her compassion, for her quiet strength, they soothed him in a way nothing else could. Catherine spoke softly when he raged. She reasoned when he commanded, and little by little, she managed what no one else could. She made the king listen. In those final years, England itself was changing as swiftly as its king aged. The country he had built through war and fire was beginning to creak under the weight of reform. The old faith was gone, replaced by a new church with Henry himself as its head. The monasteries had been stripped bare, their libraries burned, their treasures melted into coin. Villagers who once prayed in candlelight now knelt before empty altars, unsure whether to cross themselves or to hide their hands. The lords grew richer from the spoils, while the poor wandered through ruins that still smelled of incense. It was a quiet kind of grief, the sort that no proclamation could erase. Yet Henry saw none of it. In his mind, he remained the great builder of England, the father of its navy, the unifier of its crown. The people's pain was as distant to him as the songs he once composed on his lute. Catherine Parr, however, saw everything. She walked among the servants, spoke to the children, listened to the widows of soldiers, lost to Henry's endless wars. In private, she prayed for her husband's soul, though she never said so aloud. To speak of the soul to a king who feared his own was to invite ruin. Still, in the stillness of their evenings, when the fire burned low and the pain in his leg silenced him, Catherine would read to him from Scripture slowly, rhythmically, as if the words themselves could calm the fever that haunted his blood. Sometimes Henry would close his eyes and listen, and for a few moments he was no longer the tyrant or the ruler, but simply a weary man who wanted to believe that forgiveness was still possible. It was during those quiet nights that the ghosts began to return. They came not as visions but as memories that refused to fade. He would see Catherine of Aragon kneeling in the chapel, her eyes steady and sad as she declared herself his true wife before God. He would see Anne Boleyn, her dark eyes unblinking as she faced the blade, her lips forming the words, pray for the king. He would see Jane Seymour, pale and gentle, whispering his name before she died, leaving him the son who had cost her life, and then the others, Anne of Cleves, who had forgiven him without bitterness, Catherine Howard, whose youth he had destroyed, and now Catherine Parr, who still sat beside him, alive, unwavering, the only one who dared to love what he had become. Sometimes, when the pain grew too sharp, he would mutter their names under his breath, as though by speaking them he could undo what had been done. But the past never loosens its grip, it only waits. By the year 1544, England was once again at war with France. The king, bloated and feverish, insisted on leading the campaign himself. The courtiers begged him to remain in London. But Henry, remembering the shining youth who had once triumphed at the Battle of the Spurs, could not bear to be seen as weak, so he crossed the Channel, carried on a litter draped in crimson, his armour too heavy for his failing body. At Boulogne, his forces managed to seize the city, and for a brief moment the drums of victory sounded once more, but the cost was ruinous. The treasure taken from the monasteries was gone. The kingdom groaned beneath taxes and hunger. Still, Henry called it glory. He returned home exhausted but triumphant. Declaring that England had never been stronger, Catherine Parr greeted him with relief and quiet reverence. She did not question his pride or remind him of the cost. Instead, she turned her efforts to healing the fractures within the royal family. It was she who persuaded him to restore both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, two daughters he had once cast aside as illegitimate. The act surprised everyone at court. Some said it was Catherine's influence. Others whispered that perhaps the king, nearing his end, sought to mend what he had broken. Whatever the truth, it was the beginning of a strange and fragile peace. For the first time in years, the royal children dined together at the same table. Edward, the small, serious boy, destined to inherit the crown, listened shyly as his older sisters spoke of music and poetry. In that fleeting harmony, Catherine Parr saw a vision of what England could be, an echo of what Henry himself had once promised. But time, like the king's patience, was running out. His body had grown monstrous. His legs were so swollen that he could no longer walk unassisted. The courtiers had to build special pulleys and wheeled platforms to move him from chamber to chamber. His meals grew heavier, his moods darker. Sometimes, when he could not sleep, he would summon his musicians and command them to play the songs he had written in his youth, the melodies of love and triumph that once echoed through the halls of Greenwich. Yet now, when the notes drifted through the air, they sounded mournful, almost funereal, as if the music itself mourned the boy he had been. In those last months, even the bravest avoided his gaze. He trusted no one, not even his council. Accusations of treason became common currency at court. A careless word, a glance, in a hesitation. Any of these could be a death sentence. The tower filled again with prisoners, noblemen, bishops, servants, anyone who might have once whispered against him. It was as if the king, sensing death at his shoulder, sought to drag others into the grave with him. Yet Catherine Parr endured. She was nearly caught herself when jealous advisers accused her of heresy, claiming her religious writings were a threat to the crown. Henry, inflamed by their words, ordered her arrest. But the night before it was to happen, she came to him, knelt at his feet, and spoke softly. "My lord, I have only ever sought to learn from you, as any humble wife should." Her voice was calm, her eyes unwavering. The king stared at her for a long time, And then, perhaps remembering all he had lost, he reached out and touched her hand. "Then we are friends again," he said, and by morning, the warrants were quietly burned. As winter crept over London in the year 1546, the king's strength faded. He rarely left his bed, his body swollen, his face ghostly pale. The courtiers pretended that his recovery was certain, but everyone in Whitehall knew the truth. He slept little, spoke less, and when he did, his voice was thick with regret. Sometimes he would ask for Edward. Other times he would ask for Jane Seymour's portrait, gazing at it in silence for hours. The great feasts, the tournaments, the laughter all had vanished. Only the flickering candles remained, and the endless ticking of the hours. On the night of January 27th, 1547, as the wind howled across the frozen Thames, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to the palace. When he entered the chamber, he found the king lying motionless, his breath shallow, his eyes half open. The courtiers stood in silence, afraid to speak. Cranmer approached the bed and whispered, "Do you trust in God's mercy?" For a long moment there was no response. Then, slowly, the king raised his hand and squeezed the archbishop's fingers. It was the only answer he could give. Before dawn, Henry VIII, once the brightest star of Christendom, exhaled his final breath. The news spread quietly through the corridors. There were no cheers, nor mourning cries, just the soft shuffling of footsteps and the closing of doors. Outside, the first light of morning touched the river, turning it to pale silver. In the distance, the bells of Westminster began to toll, not for triumph, not for terror, but for an ending. After 37 years on the throne, the man who had defied popes, executed queens, and remade a nation was gone. His body, too large for its coffin, was sealed with difficulty, and the cortege moved slowly toward Windsor, where he was laid beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him the son he desired. And so the story of Henry VIII ended not with a roar but with a whisper. The empire he built would fracture, the faith he destroyed would return in pieces. His son, Edward, would rule briefly. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would outshine him in wisdom and grace. But his shadow would linger over them all, a reminder of how power, when fed by fear, consumes the soul that wields it. Even now, if you listen closely in the stillness of night, you might hear the faint echo of his footsteps down the corridors of Hampton Court, a heavy rhythm of regret that time itself cannot silence. And somewhere in the vast silence of history, beneath the weight of crowns and centuries, the boy who once played the lute still waits alone, afraid, and longing to be loved for who he was before he became a king. When the bells of Westminster finally fell silent, a strange stillness seemed to spread across England, as if the land itself were holding its breath after decades of thunder. Henry VIII was gone, carried through the mist to his resting place at Windsor beside Jane Seymour, the one woman whose memory had never quite left him. In death, he looked nothing like the radiant prince who had once dazzled Europe. His body, enormous and broken, was wrapped in silk and lead, his face pale as wax, the crown heavy upon his still brow. Yet for all the silence and ceremony, there was unease in the air, a quiet awareness that the storm he had unleashed would not end with him. The kingdom he left behind was not the peaceful, united England he had dreamed of, but a country trembling on the edge of something new, something uncertain, something both beautiful and terrible. His son, Edward VI. It was only 9 years old when the crown was placed upon his head. He was small and frail, but bright. His mind sharp beyond his years. His soul already weighed down by a destiny too heavy for his shoulders. The people watched the child's coronation with mixed hearts. They saw in him the promise of innocence, but also the ghost of his father's shadow. Around him gathered men who would claim to serve him, but each served himself first. Chief among them was his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, who styled himself as Lord Protector, a title that sounded noble, yet carried the scent of power. Under his guidance, England seemed to move forward into the Reformation that Henry had begun, but never finished. The Latin Mass was replaced by English prayer. Images of saints were torn from the walls, and the people were told that salvation no longer flowed through Rome but through the king's own church. At first, it all seemed noble and pure, as if the kingdom were being washed clean of superstition. But purity, when forced, soon turns to fire. Across the countryside, churches stood stripped of their colours. The paintings, the candles, the carved angels all vanished into smoke. The peasants, who had little but faith to cling to, began to whisper of betrayal. For them, the religion had not been politics, but the rhythm of their days, the ringing of bells at dawn, the murmured prayers at dusk, the comfort of knowing the saints still watched from the rafters. Now, their faith was being rewritten by scholars they could not understand, and rulers they could not see. When the people rose up, demanding the return of their altars and their holy images, the Lord Protector sent soldiers instead of priests. Rebellion met gunpowder, and the green fields of Devon and Norfolk ran red once more. Edward watched it all from behind palace walls, his blue eyes full of sadness. He was a boy raised among sermons and tutors, told that he was chosen to guide England into righteousness. Yet he was too young to understand the cruelty that righteousness demands when it is enforced by the sword. As the years passed, he grew thinner, coughing blood into his silken handkerchiefs, his voice trembling when he read the scriptures his father had fought so hard to possess. He was kind, thoughtful, perhaps too gentle for a crown forged by blood. In his chambers, he kept the Bible close and prayed long after the candles had burned low. Not for victory or power, but for peace. Yet peace was something England no longer knew. When Edward died in the summer of 1553, not yet 16 years old, the kingdom entered another storm. The men who had ruled in his name were not ready to surrender their power, and so they devised one final gamble. They proclaimed Lady Jane Grey, Henry's grandniece, as queen, a young girl barely 17, scholarly and shy, who had no desire to rule. For 9 days, she was Queen of England, sitting in a cold tower room, while the people outside cried for another name, Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the first queen, the wife cast aside. The woman wronged by Henry's will. Mary's claim to the throne was stronger, her faith unwavering, and her vengeance quiet but absolute. When she entered London, the bells that had tolled for Henry's death rang again, this time with a strange, mournful joy. The people called her Mary the Faithful, Mary the Catholic, Mary the true daughter of the old Queen. Yet as her reign began, England trembled once more. Mary had carried the weight of her mother's humiliation all her life, the exile, the whispered doubts of legitimacy, the endless years watching her father's new queens replace the old. Now that the crown was hers, she saw it not as a gift, but as divine justice. The child of Catherine of Aragon would restore England to Rome, even if it bled in the process. And bleed it did. Fires were lit in the squares, not for warmth, but for purification. Those who refused to renounce the new faith bishops, Schkulas, Humble believers were bound to stakes and burned as heretics. The smell of smoke became the scent of Mary's England. The people who had once cheered her now watched in silence as the flames climbed higher, devouring both her enemies and her mercy. Yet in her mind, she was not cruel, only devout. She saw herself as her mother's avenger, her father's correction, God's own instrument. But faith, when sharpened by pain, becomes a blade that cuts indiscriminately. The woman the people once pitied became known in time as Bloody Mary. And still, fate was not finished with the House of Tudor. In 1558, Mary died without children, her body frail, her heart broken, her soul restless. She had married the King of Spain in the hope of bearing a son, but her womb betrayed her with phantom pregnancies, cruel illusions that left her in despair. As her body failed, she whispered the name of her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose blood Mary had despised all her life. "Let her reign," she murmured, "and may God forgive her mother." And with that, the circle of fate closed, and a new dawn began to rise. When Elizabeth I was crowned, England held its breath once again. The daughter of the woman condemned as a witch now stood on the same throne her father had once stained with blood. The people saw in her something both familiar and strange: her mother's eyes, her father's voice, and a calmness that belonged only to herself. She had survived her father's anger, her sister's suspicion, the hatred of those who called her bastard and heretic. Yet she had learned from them all, learned that power could destroy as easily as it could build, that silence was sometimes wiser than defiance, that mercy could be the sharpest weapon of all. Und hier rein, the fires dimmed, the executions slowed, and the land began to breathe again. The great ships Henry had built became the vessels of a new empire. England turned its gaze outward, toward the sea and the unknown, seeking not salvation, but discovery. Elizabeth walked through the gardens of Whitehall with a composure that bordered on otherworldly. Those who saw her said she moved like moonlight, untouchable yet luminous. And though she carried the weight of her father's name, she never let it crush her. When courtiers pressed her to marry, she only smiled and said, "I am already wedded to England." It was in her that Henry's restless ambition finally found peace. The church he had torn from Rome became a middle path between extremes, neither fully Catholic nor wholly Protestant, but something uniquely English, something enduring. The faith that had once divided his kingdom now bound it together, the same crown that had cost 6 women their happiness, and 2 their lives, rested easily upon the head of one who needed no husband to define her. In Elizabeth, the ghosts of Henry's reign found their quiet rest. Catherine's dignity, Anne's courage, Jane's gentleness all living again in their daughter's calm and steady gaze. And yet, even as her reign shone like sunlight after the storm, the shadow of her father lingered. For every triumph she achieved, every peace she kept, every battle she won, the echo of his name followed her. In the great halls of Hampton Court, where portraits of kings and queens watched from the walls, visitors said that sometimes, in the stillness after midnight, they could hear the slow, uneven tread of heavy boots along the gallery, the sound of a man who could not rest. Some swore they heard the faint strains of a lute drifting through the darkness, the melody of a song long forgotten, played by invisible hands. Others said they had seen him in dreams, no longer the bloated tyrant, but the young prince in gold, smiling, unburdened, walking toward the light he had once turned away from. So ends the reign of Henry VIII, not in the roar of cannons or the clash of armies, but in the quiet legacy of those who came after him. The empire he dreamed of became real. though not by his own hand. The daughters he feared became the queens who carried his blood into eternity. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the reach of time, the restless king finally understood the truth that had eluded him in life, that no power can command love, no crown can conquer mortality, and no man, no matter how mighty, can silence the voice of his own heart. And as England drifted into a new century, the age of Shakespeare and the great sea voyages, the story of Henry faded into legend. Yet every legend carries a heartbeat, fin but éternel. His remains lie beneath the stone floor of St. George's Chapel. Beside the woman who gave him his only son, the world has forgotten their voices. But if you lean close enough, if you listen in the hush between bells, you might still hear the echo of the boy who once laughed among the courtiers of Greenwich, dreaming not of thrones or wars, but of music, of love, of something simple and good. For all his sins, for all his fury, he was, at his core, just a man flawed, frightened, yearning for something pure that power could never give him. And so, as the centuries pass and the names of kings grow distant, the tale of Henry remains not as a warning or a curse, but as a mirror, for in him we see the endless struggle between light and shadow, love and control, faith and fear. And in that reflection, perhaps, we glimpse a truth as old as time, that even those who wear crowns cannot escape the frailty of the human soul. The reign of Elizabeth I unfolded like the long breath after a storm, the years of terror and blood giving way to a quiet, steady light. She ruled with the patience of someone who had lived through the sharpest edges of history and survived them all. She had watched her mother die, her sister turn the kingdom into an altar of flame, and her father become the very god he once feared. From all of it, she had learned that power was a fragile thing, that it must be worn like silk, never clenched like iron. She became what her father never could, a monarch who understood both mercy and restraint. And yet, even as her England bloomed into art, discovery, and faith renewed, the echo of Henry still drifted through the corridors of memory. For Elizabeth was not merely his daughter, she was his unfinished prayer, the peace that followed his rage, the light born from his darkness. In the first years of her rule, England trembled, uncertain of her strength. Many expected her to fall to Mary, to surrender her authority, to become a symbol rather than a sovereign. The men of her court, seasoned by decades of war, and the rule of her father and sister, doubted that a woman could command the hearts of her people. But Elizabeth, young though she was, had long mastered the art of silence. She had survived the Tower itself as a princess, accused of treason. She had learned to smile when afraid, to speak when silence would have condemned her, and to stand alone when everyone else fled. So when they looked into her calm, unreadable eyes, even the most hardened lords hesitated. She did not roar as Henry had done. She did not weep as Mary had done. She simply stood still. And in that stillness there was power. The first years of her reign were like a slow turning of the seasons. She inherited a nation divided, half Catholic, half Protestant, exhausted from the pendulum of faith that had swung violently between her father's defiance and her sister's vengeance. Elizabeth, cautious but resolute, crafted what she called a middle path, a church that spoke in English but carried the beauty of old rituals, a faith that offered compromise rather than confrontation. It was not perfection, but it was peace. Her subjects, weary of fire and fear, embraced it like sunlight after years of rain. The bells rang again, not for the execution of heretics or traitors, but for the coronation of a queen who sought balance instead of blood, She filled her court with poets, painters, philosophers, and adventurers. The halls that had once echoed with screams and decrees now hummed with laughter, music, and the scent of roses. William Shakespeare, a boy from Stratford, would one day give voice to the human heart in her language. Sir Francis Drake would sail across oceans her father had only dreamed of. Edmund Spenser would write of knights and queens who mirrored her spirit. England was alive again. No longer a kingdom trembling under divine punishment, but a nation daring to dream. And yet Elizabeth never forgot the price her family had paid for glory. Behind every smile at court lay the knowledge of how quickly admiration could turn to accusation, how love could sour into death. Those who sought to rule her heart learned quickly that it could not be ruled. Suitors came from every corner of Europe, princes, dukes, kings, each hoping to secure the crown beside her. But she kept them all at a distance. "I will have but one mistress here," she told her ministers, "and no master." Still, there were moments of tenderness. Among her courtiers was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, her childhood companion, her confidant, the man who perhaps came closest to knowing the woman beneath the crown. For years, whispers filled the court about their closeness. The stolen glances, the way her hand lingered on his sleeve, yet duty and scandal both held her back. When his wife, Amy Robsart, died under mysterious circumstances, the rumours burned like wildfire. And Elizabeth, who ruled with her father's blood in her veins, knew she could not be seen as a woman overcome by desire. She buried her heart in silence, turning love into loyalty, longing into legend. Still, even in the height of her majesty, the ghost of Henry VIII walked beside her. Sometimes, when she sat alone in her chambers at Whitehall, the light of the fire would catch the edges of his portrait hanging on the wall, the same cold eyes, the same proud line of the jaw. She would stare at it for a long time, remembering the stories her tutors had whispered of his fury, his brilliance, his contradictions. She knew that without his defiance, she might never have reigned. Yet she also knew that everything he had built had nearly destroyed the country she loved. Perhaps that was why she ruled, as she did not through terror, but through endurance, not through faith in her own divinity, but in her humanity. She spoke often of her father, but rarely of her mother. Still, every time she entered the chapel, every time she knelt to pray, she felt the presence of both the sinner and the saint, the king and the condemned woven into her soul. The years flowed gently, but beneath the calm surface of Elizabeth's reign, danger never truly vanished. The old wounds of religion still throbbed in secret. Plots bloomed in the dark, carried by letters, whispers, and foreign gold. Across the Channel, Philip of Spain, Mary's widower and the most powerful monarch in Christendom, waited for her to falter. To him, Elizabeth was not merely a heretic, but an insult, a Protestant woman wearing a crown that should have belonged to a Catholic queen. Yet Elizabeth, ever cautious, moved with the precision of a chess master. She balanced diplomacy and defiance with impossible grace, playing kings against popes, spies against assassins. Her network of informants, led by Sir Francis Walsingham, became the unseen web that kept her safe, catching conspiracies before they could take root. Even when her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, sought refuge in England and later plotted her downfall, Elizabeth hesitated before signing her death warrant. She knew that blood I once spilled could never be forgotten. But when Mary's complicity became undeniable, Elizabeth, with a heart heavy as iron, signed her cousin's fate. The execution that followed haunted her for the rest of her life. It was not long after that the storm came the great test of her reign, the Spanish Armada. In the summer of 1588, the horizon darkened with sails as far as the eye could see. A floating fortress sent by Philip to crush the Protestant queen and reclaim England for Rome. The air trembled with fear. Yet Elizabeth did not hide behind her palace walls. She rode out to Tilbury, wearing armour over her gown, her hair flowing like flame in the wind. Before her trembling soldiers, she spoke words that would echo for centuries. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The men cheered, tears shining in their eyes. And when the winds turned against Spain, scattering the Armada to ruin, they swore that the very heavens had chosen her. That victory marked the high tide of her reign. England, once torn by faith and fear, now stood proud and unbroken. Yet even triumph carries loneliness. Elizabeth, now past her youth, began to feel the weight of the years. One by one, those she had loved and trusted slipped away. Leicester dead, her old counsellors gone, the laughter of her youth fading into memory. The court that had once shimmered with colour grew quieter. And she, the Virgin Queen, who had given herself wholly to her realm, found herself surrounded by shadows. In the stillness of her final winters, she would sometimes walk the galleries of Whitehall at night, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floors. The portraits of her ancestors lined the walls, her father in crimson, her mother in gold. The candles flickered, as if stirred by unseen hands, and she would pause. Before Henry's likeness, the face stared back stern, magnificent, and haunted. She would think of all he had destroyed to build the throne she now guarded. And perhaps, somewhere deep in her heart, she forgave him, not as a king, not as a tyrant, but as a man trapped by his own need to be eternal. When her final days came, Elizabeth refused to take to her bed. She sat upon the cushions in her chamber, wrapped in silks, her crown beside her, her eyes distant. The courtiers begged her to rest, but she only whispered, "My spirit cannot sleep." For days she neither ate nor spoke. She seemed to be listening to something beyond the walls, beyond the world itself. On a cold March morning in the year 1603, she closed her eyes for the last time. No priests were called, no trumpets sounded. The greatest Queen of England slipped quietly into eternity, leaving behind a nation reborn and a legacy carved not in stone, but in the hearts of her people. As the news spread, London fell silent. Then, slowly, the bells began to toll, not in mourning, but in awe. The reign that had begun in doubt had ended in glory. And yet, even as her body was carried to Westminster, laid to rest above her half-sister Mary in a single tomb, the inscription chosen for them both whispered a truth that transcended all their wars, all their wounds, partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep together in hope of resurrection. And so the story of Henry's bloodline, born in fire and finished in peace, closed at last. But stories, like rivers, never truly end. They only change course. The Tudors faded, yet their shadows stretched across the centuries. The world they built of faith and rebellion, of art and empire, of love and ruin became the foundation of everything that followed. Somewhere beyond the flow of time, in that strange and endless twilight where history becomes memory, the ghosts of Henry and Elizabeth walk side by side through the echoing corridors of eternity, father and daughter, king and queen, bound forever by the crown that made them and the love that could never set them free. When Elizabeth I was gone, England stood still, as though time itself had paused to listen to the silence she left behind. The golden age that had flourished under her reign dimmed into a long twilight, and the proud flame of the Tudors flickered one last time before sinking into the dusk of history. The crown she had worn so fiercely passed not to a child of her blood, for she had none, but to a distant relative across the northern border, a king whose voice carried the cadence of another land. Thus began the reign of James of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, the Queen Elizabeth had once condemned to death. In that moment, the two rival lines, the Tudors and the Stuarts, were joined, not by love or reconciliation, but by the quiet inevitability of fate. And though Elizabeth's body rested beneath the vaulted arches of Westminster, her spirit lingered in the hearts of her people, watching, as if unwilling to surrender the realm her father had built through fury and her own grace had redeemed. The new king arrived in London, with the spring fog curling around the city's towers. The people, weary of the uncertainties that followed a monarch's death, lined the streets in uneasy celebration. They shouted, "God save the king," though many whispered the name of Elizabeth under their breath. James I came from a kingdom of mountains and ghosts, a land where crowns had been won by daggers as often as by inheritance. His rule began not with triumph, but with curiosity. He was a scholar, a thinker, a man of scripture and superstition. He believed himself divinely chosen to unite England and Scotland under one faith, one law, one destiny. Yet he inherited a realm whose soul was already fractured, its heart still beating with the echoes of Henry's ambition and Elizabeth's restraint. The great shadow of Henry VIII still stretched across every church, every law, every thought of what it meant to be English. He had severed the chain that bound the country to Rome, and that chain could never be repaired. The Protestant church he had forged in fury had taken root under Edward, been burned under Mary, and then reborn under Elizabeth. But now it trembled once again under the weight of division. James, determined to hold the peace, called together bishops and scholars to discuss a common translation of the Scriptures, a book that would unite the kingdom in both faith and language. Out of this came the King James Bible, a work that would outlive its creator, its rhythm echoing through centuries of prayer and poetry. Yet even as his scribes wrote of light and mercy, darkness brewed beyond the palace walls. In November of the year 1605, the scent of gunpowder filled the air beneath Parliament's stone floor. A man named Guy Fawkes, his hands steady with purpose, was discovered beside barrels of explosives meant to erase the king and his government in one fiery instant. It was to be a Catholic vengeance, a reckoning for decades of persecution, an attempt to return England to Rome's embrace. The plot failed, but the fear it awakened would never fade. In the aftermath, new fires were lit, not in rebellion but in punishment. The names of traitors were carved into public memory, their bodies scattered as warnings. James, who had hoped to rule with reason, found himself tightening his grip, his eyes darting to every shadow. The unity he sought turned into suspicion. He could not see that the poison had been planted long before him, in the moment his predecessor's father had torn the nation from the Pope's hand. Still, for a time, peace endured. The arts flourished. The stage became the beating heart of London. Shakespeare, now in his final years, wrote of kings and ghosts, of ambition and ruin, of men who mistook power for immortality. Audiences watched his tragedies and saw themselves the sins of their ancestors reflected in verse. They watched Macbeth, a tale of a Scottish king consumed by prophecy, and whispered that perhaps the playwright was daring to hold a mirror to the new monarch himself. In the play's witches and their dark murmurs, one could hear the echo of Henry's own belief that fate could be commanded, that divine will could be moulded by a human hand. The Tudors were gone, but their story had become the soul of England's imagination, retold not in history books, but on the stage. In candlelight, in song, but kingdoms, like men, cannot live on memory alone. The golden days faded into the grey unease of debt, religious tension, and political doubt. James's dreams of uniting England and Scotland in peace unravelled as centuries of mistrust surfaced again. His attempts at diplomacy often descended into ridicule. The courtiers who once fawned over Elizabeth's brilliance now mocked his awkward manners and Scottish tongue. Yet he was not cruel. He preferred argument to execution, books to bloodshed, peace to glory. Perhaps that was why his reign lacked the fire that had defined his predecessors. And when he died in 1625, the throne passed to his son Charles I, a man more like Henry than he would ever admit, handsome, proud, convinced of his divine right, and tragically blind to the warning written in his own family's story. Where Henry had fought popes, Charles would fight Parliament. The struggle that followed was not of sword against church, but of crown against conscience. The people, having endured a century of royal absolutes, began to question whether kings truly ruled by heaven's decree. England, still haunted by the memory of tyrants, found itself once again on the edge of rebellion. Oliver Cromwell, a stern Puritan soldier with fire in his eyes, rose against the throne, leading armies in the name of liberty and faith. The clash that ensued tore the nation apart, father against son, neighbour against neighbour, until, in the winter of 1649, the unthinkable happened. A king was tried by his own subjects and sentenced to die. On the morning of his execution, Charles I walked calmly onto the scaffold, looked out over the silent crowd, and declared, "I am the martyr of the people." When the axe fell, a gust of wind lifted the crimson mist, and in that instant, the dream of divine monarchy, the dream that had driven Henry to defy Rome and shape a new world, shattered into dust. England became a republic. If only for a time, Cromwell ruled not as a king, but as something worse, a man who wore righteousness as armour and wielded faith as a weapon. The theatres were closed, the music silenced, the laughter of Elizabeth's age replaced by sermons and shadows. The ghost of Henry, who had once destroyed the monasteries, might have smiled from the grave. The same fire that had burned through his soul now consumed his country. When Cromwell died and the monarchy was restored under Charles II, the people rejoiced, not for the return of kings, but for the return of life itself, the songs, the plays, the freedom to dream. Through all these transformations, Henry's legacy lingered. Every law passed, every church built, every oath sworn in the name of England carried a trace of his will. The separation from Rome, once a matter of marriage and pride, had become the foundation of national identity. No longer would England kneel before a foreign throne. Its kings would be its own. Its faith, its own. Its destiny, its own. And yet, the cost of that independence was endless unrest. The country learned, as Henry never had, that freedom is not won by domination, but by endurance. By the time the century closed, England had weathered fire, war, plague, and revolution. The Tudors were long dead, their bones sealed in ornate tombs. But their ghosts refused to sleep. Writers, painters, and historians reached back to them, as if to find in their passions some reflection of their own age. They saw in Henry not merely a tyrant, but a mirror of mankind's eternal hunger for control, for love, for immortality. They saw in Elizabeth the proof that greatness could be born from pain, They saw in the blood of their reigns the beginning of what England had become, a nation fierce in its independence, proud in its contradictions, haunted by the beauty and terror of its own making. And even now, centuries later, when the candlelight flickers against the marble of Westminster Abbey, where Henry lies beneath his carved effigy, the air still seems to tremble with memory. Tourists walk above the stone, unaware that beneath their feet rest the bones of a man who once made the world bow to his will. Yet sometimes, when the abbey is empty and the wind hums through its arches, the sound of distant chanting can be heard, faint and sorrowful, as if the monks he condemned are still praying for his soul. England has changed 1,000 times since then. Empires have risen and fallen. Kings have come and gone. And the language itself has shifted like a tide. But Henry's shadow remains, long and unbroken, cast not upon the land but upon the human heart. For in his story lies a truth too vast to fade, that every act of creation carries within it the seed of destruction, that every crown rests upon a fragile pulse. That power, no matter how absolute, is always haunted by love, lost and faith betrayed. And so, as the centuries march on and the night deepens over London's river, the ghosts of the Tudors remain flickering beneath the moon, whispering through the fog, reminding every generation that kings and queens are only ever reflections of their people's dreams. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the reach of time, Henry VIII still walks the endless corridors of Hampton Court, neither damned nor forgiven, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone. Not as a tyrant, not as a god, but as a man who once believed that by breaking the world, he could make it whole again. Centuries passed, and still the name Henry VIII whispered through the corridors of time like a lingering storm that refuses to fade. The world changed beyond recognition, but the memory of that golden, violent king clung to England like an old scar, a mark of both triumph and torment. The castles he had built began to crumble into silence. Their tapestries faded, their windows clouded with dust, yet his shadow lived on, not just in the marble of Westminster or the stones of Hampton Court, but in the bloodstream of a nation that could never quite forget its first great fracture between faith and fear. Every age after his carried something of him, the pride, the defiance, the refusal to bow to any power but its own. It was as if, in breaking his world apart, he had also set the pattern for centuries to come, a pattern of rebellion, reinvention, and restless yearning for something greater than obedience. By the dawn of the 18th century, England was no longer the insular kingdom of Henry's time. It was an empire, vast and roaring, stretching across oceans and continents. The ships that glided from the Thames bore not only goods and gold, but ideas, language, and law. They carried the same pulse of ambition that had once driven Henry to defy the Pope, though now it beat in different hearts, under different banners. The monarchs who followed him no longer claimed the divine fire that had consumed the Tudors. They ruled by compromise, by parliament, by the slow machinery of reason. Yet in every parliamentarian debate, in every clash between throne and people, one could still feel the ghost of that first argument between a king and the world, who has the right to command conscience. The Victorians, centuries later, would look back on Henry's reign with a mixture of horror and fascination. They saw in him both the barbarism they had outgrown and the vitality they secretly envied. Painters dressed him in velvet and gold. Poets turned his tragedy into myth, and scholars filled shelves with his name. The public loved him, not for his holiness or his cruelty, but for his magnitude, for being too vast, too human, too flawed to ever fit neatly into any judgment. To them, he was the embodiment of England's will, the proof that even sin, when grand enough, becomes history. In those later centuries, the monasteries Henry had destroyed became ruins tangled with ivy and birdsong. Tourists wandered through them, tracing fingers along the broken altars. Feeling something between awe and melancholy, they spoke softly, as if the stones still listened. Some swore that, on still evenings, they could hear chanting faint, otherworldly, the voices of monks rising through time itself. It was said that no grass grew evenly on the ground where the abbeys had fallen, that the earth there still remembered its desecration. The English countryside, so calm to the eye, carried that silence within it like an old confession. And yet, despite all the blood and ruin, Henry's England had survived, had become stronger. Even the church he created still stood, not as an empire of fear, but as a curious testament to balance, neither wholly Catholic nor entirely Protestant. It was an uneasy peace, made holy by endurance. Priests in white robes still read prayers in the language he had once demanded, their voices soft beneath the vaulted ceilings he had claimed for himself. The irony was cruel and perfect. The tyrant who had sought control through destruction had, in the end, given his people the foundation of freedom. But time is a patient sculptor, and even kings are only clay. The centuries smoothed Henry's rage into legend, softened his cruelty into story, turned his wives into icons, each one standing for something greater than herself. Catherine of Aragon, the faithful heart of endurance; Anne Boleyn, the flame of ambition; Jane Seymour, the saint of sacrifice; Anne of Cleves, the quiet survivor; Catherine Howard, the ghost of youth; Catherine Parr, the healer of wounds. Together, they became more than history. They became a mirror for every soul who ever loved, defied, or suffered in silence. And above them all, Henry remained, neither hero nor monster, but a kind of living parable, a man who proved that power and loneliness are one and the same. In modern London, the tourists still come. They walk through the courtyards of Hampton Court, where the river hums softly beneath grey skies. They step into the great hall with its hammer-beam ceiling and its banners fluttering like memories. Some laugh, some whisper, some linger too long before the portraits. In one, Henry stands broad and imperious, his eyes steady, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The painter's darkened with age, but his gaze remains sharp enough to pierce through centuries. Children point and ask their parents who he was, and the answer always comes in a half-remembered tone. He was the king with 6 wives. He killed 2 of them. They say it lightly, almost like a fairy tale, not realizing how much of their world still beats with his echo. Historians still argue about him. Was he mad? Brilliant? Cruel? Or simply human? Was he driven by faith or vanity? By destiny or desire? Every generation remakes him in its own image. The Victorians saw him as the father of modern England. The Romantics painted him as the tragic titan who defied God. The 20th century called him the first politician of power. But perhaps he was none of those things or all of them at once. Perhaps he was just a mirror held up to humanity's oldest struggle, the longing to master one's fate and the terror of discovering that fate is never truly ours to command. There are nights when the curators of Hampton Court, locking the gates after the crowds have gone, swear they hear something, a faint echo in the long gallery, a whisper behind the chapel door, the scent of smoke, the creak of boots on polished floors, the distant hum of a lute. Some dismiss it as imagination, others, with a knowing smile, say softly, "He never really left." They speak of him not as a ghost, but as a presence as if the weight of his will had pressed itself into the stones. Perhaps that is the fate of those who burn too brightly their bodies perish. But their hunger remains, wandering forever between shadow and flame. And somewhere beyond the modern noise, the cars, the crowds, the endless screens, there is still that same river, the Thames, flowing past the palaces and the graves. On misty mornings, when the city sleeps, the water glimmers with the same dull silver that once reflected his face. The wind moves across it like a whisper, carrying the faintest echo of bells, the same bells that rang for his coronation, his weddings, his wars, his death. Their sound has long since changed, but their rhythm remains, woven into the pulse of London itself. Every toll is a heartbeat of history, a reminder that power fades, but memory endures. For in truth, Henry's story was never just his own. It was the story of how belief can be both salvation and ruin, how love can become a weapon, how the hunger for legacy can destroy the very thing it seeks to preserve. It was the story of humanity itself, played out on the grandest stage imaginable. A man who reached for heaven and instead found himself trapped between the altar and the crown. His reign was the dawn of the modern world, but it was also its warning, and so the centuries continue to turn. The world grows louder, faster, more distant from the time of kings and chapels. Yet his name still surfaces on screens. In plays, in whispered jokes and solemn lectures, he has become both symbol and myth. Loved and loathed, studied and misunderstood, each retelling reshapes him. But the heart of the story never changes. It is not about a king who killed his wives, or a monarch who broke from Rome. It is about the human soul's endless war between desire and devotion, between freedom and consequence. If you walk the quiet halls of Westminster at night, when the tourists have gone and the city hums faintly beyond the stone walls, you may hear the wind moving through the cloisters. It sounds almost like a sigh. Beneath the marble lies the dust of kings and queens, of warriors and saints, all bound by the same truth, that greatness is only ever borrowed. That time reclaims even the mightiest. But sometimes, if you stand very still, you might feel it, the faint hum of something vast and ancient, something that once believed it could command eternity. That is Henry's legacy, not his churches, not his battles, not his endless search for heirs, but the lesson hidden beneath it all. Power will build empires, but love alone builds remembrance. The man who sought to rule both God and destiny was, in the end, remembered not for his victories, but for his humanity, the frailty beneath the armor, the yearning beneath the pride. And perhaps that is why, after 500 years, his story still breathes. Because it is not just the story of a king, it is the story of us all, the rise and fall of will against the quiet, inexorable mercy of time. And as the river keeps flowing, carrying centuries upon its surface, the old palace stands unmoved. The banners hang still. The air smells faintly of wax and rain. And in the empty great hall, a single beam of light breaks through the stained glass. It lands upon the spot where once a young man in gold stood before his court, certain that he would live forever. And in that silence, if you close your eyes, you might almost hear him breathe. The centuries have folded over Henry VIII like layers of dust upon a golden mirror, softening the edges of his cruelty, dimming the brilliance of his glory, but never erasing his reflection. He remains, in some strange way, alive, not in body, but in presence, in the quiet pulse of a nation that still speaks his language, still sings in his tongue, still walks through the world, he reshaped with his will. England changed beyond all measure, and yet, Beneath the whir of machines and the roar of cities, one can still hear the echo of his footsteps steady, deliberate, filled with the rhythm of command. His ghost lingers not only in palaces and portraits, but in the very idea of what it means to stand alone before the impossible and say, "I will not bow." The world that once trembled beneath his crown has long since forgotten kings. Thrones became symbols, crowns became relics, and the divine right he once invoked became a whisper in the pages of history. The age of empires rose and fell like tides, each one believing itself eternal, each one discovering, as Henry did, that eternity is a fragile illusion. The sun that once never set on the British Empire now fades quietly over oceans he never saw. But the spirit that built it, the unyielding defiance, the hunger to shape destiny was born in his fire. His fury had forged a nation's character stubborn, visionary, impossible to contain, even in an age of democracy and doubt. That same pulse beats beneath the modern heart of England, disguised as independence, ambition, or pride. Yet if Henry's shadow stretches still, so too do the shadows of those who suffered beneath it. The 6 women who shared his name live not as victims, but as voices each speaking across time with a truth he could never face. Catherine of Aragon, steadfast and serene, remains the image of dignity and defeat, her faith unbroken even when her heart was crushed. Anne Boleyn, bold and clever, walks forever at the edge of myth, her executioner's blade immortalizing her courage more than her crown ever did. Jane Seymour, gentle and tragic, stands as a reminder that even the king's love could be fatal. Anne of Cleves, pragmatic and smiling, outlived him all, proof that survival is its own quiet victory. Catherine Howard, the doomed child of passion, reminds the world that innocence is never safe in the presence of power. And Catherine Parr, patient and wise, became the mirror that forced Henry to glimpse his own humanity before death took him. Together, their stories became the true requiem of his reign, a symphony of women's voices rising from the silence he imposed. In time, poets and playwrights would resurrect them all, giving them back their laughter, their grief, their defiance. They became not queens of flesh, but queens of story, haunting not palaces, but hearts. They remind the world that history is never written by one voice alone, that even the mightiest king is surrounded by a chorus of the forgotten, and perhaps that is the quiet justice time delivers, the slow redemption that no throne can deny. Every generation has its own Henry. The Victorians saw him as the father of empire. The Romantics saw him as a wounded giant. The modern world sees him as a warning proof of what happens when desire outruns wisdom. When the hunger to control becomes greater than the capacity to love. Psychologists call him a study in narcissism. Historians call him a political revolutionary. Theologians call him a heretic. And the people, always the people, call him simply fascinating. For there is something eternal about the contradiction he embodies, the man who destroyed what he most believed in, the believer who murdered faith itself. He is the reflection no age can resist, because every age carries a little of his madness within it. And what of his blood, his lineage, his dream of immortality through heirs? That, too, dissolved into irony. The son for whom he broke heaven's laws, Edward, died a boy. The daughter he despised, Mary, ruled in fire and sorrow. The daughter he ignored, Elizabeth, became England's greatest queen. The line he longed to continue ended with her. Yet through her, his legacy endured far beyond his name. It is a strange kind of justice that the man who sought eternity through sons found it instead through a daughter he never wanted, and through a nation he could never control. Sometimes, in the grey light of dawn, The city still feels ancient. The mist hangs low over the Thames, and for a moment, the hum of traffic fades. The air smells faintly of stone and smoke, and one can almost see him standing on the bridge, broad-shouldered, eyes sharp. The ghost of the king who once believed the river itself obeyed his will. The water flows on, indifferent, carrying century downstream, washing away glory and ruin alike. And yet, in its endless current, Henry's reflection flickers for a heartbeat, a reminder that nothing, not even time, can entirely erase those who changed the course of the world. Inside Hampton Court, where the red brick walls glow dimly under the rain, his presence is strongest. The corridors stretch endlessly, lined with portraits, tapestries, and whispers. Visitors walk carefully, their footsteps echoing on the same floors where queens once pleaded, courtiers once schemed, and the king himself once raged. In the vast kitchen where feasts were prepared for 1,000 mouths, the air still carries a trace of roasted meat and wine. In the chapel, the light falls through stained glass like broken jewels, illuminating the royal pew where he once knelt half in prayer, half in pride. They say that on certain nights, after the gates have closed, the guards hear footsteps pacing the long gallery, heavy and deliberate. They hear doors open that no wind could move. And sometimes, when the silence grows too deep, they hear the faint sound of a sigh. Some say it is Henry, searching for peace he never found. Others say it is the echo of those he wronged, reminding him that eternity is not measured in crowns but in conscience. Beyond England, his legend took root like wild ivy. Across Europe, scholars and storytellers debated his soul. In Spain, he was the monster who broke a sainted queen. In France, he was the brute who betrayed chivalry for lust. In Rome, he was the heretic who split Christendom. Yet in England, he became something else entirely, a paradox made sacred by familiarity. The people could not hate him, because in his defiance they recognized themselves. He was their arrogance, their brilliance, their longing to command destiny. To condemn him would be to condemn their own reflection. And so, even now, they keep his memory alive not as worship, not as absolution, but as acknowledgement. For nations, like men, are made not of virtues, but of contradictions. 500 years have passed since his death. And yet, if you listen closely, you can still feel him breathing in the pulse of modern England, in the clash between tradition and progress, in the quiet stubbornness of its people, in the humour that hides its pain. Henry's ghost lingers. He lives in the refusal to kneel, in the pride that masks vulnerability, in the endless negotiation between faith and reason. His story reminds the world that progress is born not from purity, but from struggle, that even ruin can give birth to something enduring. There is something strangely tender about the thought of him now, not as the tyrant king, but as the lonely man who wanted to be loved by God and found only silence in return. For all his power, all his conquests, all his wives and wars, he died like every other soul alone, uncertain, reaching for mercy. Perhaps in that moment, as the light dimmed and his hand gripped the archbishop's, he finally understood what no one had dared tell him, that love cannot be commanded, and that faith cannot be forced. The king who thought he could control heaven learned, in the end, that heaven controls nothing but time. And so, as the centuries move further away from his reign, Henry remains neither villain nor hero, but something far more enduring human. His life was not a warning or a celebration, but a mirror reflecting the brilliance and blindness of all who dare to reach too high. Every time we chase our desires beyond the limits of mercy, every time we build empires out of fear, every time we confuse control with love, we walk in his footsteps. Perhaps that is why the world cannot stop telling his story. Because it is not just his, it is ours. It is the story of creation and destruction, of faith and betrayal, two of hearts that ache for eternity, and hands that tremble with the weight of power. It is the story of what it means to be human, to hunger, to fall, to rise, and to be haunted by our own reflection. And if, one evening, you stand beside the river as the city lights shimmer like distant stars, and the sound of bells drifts faintly through the fog, you might feel it, the soft brush of history breathing down your neck. You might imagine, just for a moment, a figure watching from the shadows of Hampton's walls, his crown long gone, his eyes still searching. He does not seek power anymore, nor forgiveness, but remembrance. For as long as his story is told, as long as his name is whispered between truth and myth, Henry VIII will never truly be dead. And perhaps that is the closest any man, even our king, can ever come to eternity.